Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to the 2025 Tanner Lecture on Human Values. The Tanner Lectures are now in their 47th year, and they were established by the American scholar, industrialist, and philanthropist Obert Clark Tanner. They're held at several leading universities around the globe, and their purpose is to illuminate the moral and philosophical issues that shape human life. In creating the lectureships, Professor Tanner said, "I hope these lectures will contribute to the intellectual and moral life of mankind. I see them simply as a search for a better understanding of human behaviour and human values." Appointment as a Tanner lecturer is a recognition of an exceptionally distinguished and important contribution to the field of human values. We are deeply honoured this evening to welcome Dr. Volker Türk, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, as our 2025 Tanner Lecturer. Dr. Türk has devoted his career to the advancement of human dignity and international law. A native of Austria, he holds a doctorate in international law from the University of Vienna, and over 3 decades he has served in senior roles across the UN system, notably within the UN Refugee Agency, before his appointment in 2022 as High Commissioner for Human Rights. In his timely lecture this evening, Human Rights, Cooling a Planet on Fire, Dr. Türk will address one of the most urgent moral imperatives of our time, the intersection of climate change and human rights. He will explore how our international human rights framework can, indeed must, respond to the global environmental crisis. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Volker Türk.
Well, Mr. Principal, Vice Chancellor, distinguished guests, faculty members, students, everyone here in the audience, it's an honor to participate in this lecture series, an important lecture series, and it's a real pleasure to be with you here today. The Tanner Lectures on Human Values are indeed a beacon of learning, of intellectual curiosity, of exchange, of diverse views. It's really everything we treasure about university education, actually. And we see how much university education gets sometimes questioned these days, and it's important to honor this. And we have, in fact, not found any better place than a university to debate, to discuss, and to develop ideas and to evolve these ideas. And indeed, universities are the natural home of creativity, of dialogue, that also influences policymaking and governance. It is thanks to the research done by universities, including Oxford, that governments can model climate policy options and their impact, that we can predict how ice sheets respond to warming, and we have secured incredible breakthroughs in renewable energy technology, not least because of that. Oxford, with its linked courtyards and dreaming spires, takes us back to the medieval roots of Western learning, while remaining at the cutting edge of scientific research. Human values and human rights have been at the center of Oxford's mission, and I look forward to our joint project with Oxford and a number of universities around the world in honor of World Environment Day later this week and the Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Summit. Distinguished guests, dear friends, I've always felt a very deep bond with nature. And I remember growing up in Austria with some of my family's members being biologists, and in the 70s, discussions at dinner table around the impact that even at that time, one of my uncles was saying it, what the implications of burning fossil fuels would mean for the planet. And to be honest, I remember when I was sort of 15-year-old, it did have an impact on me, and it's something that troubled me deeply. And somehow, 50 years later, some in the world are still in denial about a fundamental fact. Our well-being and survival as a species are inseparable from the health of our planet and our environment. We are part of nature, and our fate is inextricably linked with nature. The very oxygen that we breathe is constantly recycled between the land, the oceans, and the atmosphere. Our food and water depends on plants and animals, birds and insects, rivers and seas. And we have a responsibility to treat our planet with respect, to protect its glaciers and forests, to support the diversity of species on land and in the sea, to keep our rivers and lakes clean, to preserve nature, including ourselves. The widespread misconception that nature is a hierarchy with Homo sapiens at its apex is at the root of the planetary crisis that wreak havoc across the world. And the evidence is everywhere. Each year, we consume some 1.7 times more resources than our planet can regenerate. The extraction and burning of fossil fuels is trapping humanity in a furnace. Climate impacts are already hitting every country with huge human and economic costs. Almost half of humanity live in climate hotspots, where people are 15 times more likely to die of climate-related disasters. According to Oxfam, the world's richest 1% are responsible for more carbon emissions than the poorest 66%. Meanwhile, our global food systems, which allow massive waste while millions go hungry, are driving an unprecedented loss of biodiversity. 1 million of the world's estimated 8 million plant and animal species are threatened with extinction. And by 2050, there could be more plastic in the ocean than fish, according to some research. Exposure to pesticides, heavy metals, and radioactive waste are severely impacting people's well-being and violating their rights. Not only have we created a false separation from nature, we are deluded enough to believe we can make nature bend our will. Attempts to subjugate and exploit our fragile ecosystem have resulted in unpredictable and dangerous consequences. From disrupting water cycles to remaking landscapes, from forever chemicals to the introduction of invasive species, there is a long list of attempted solutions that turned out to be problems. And yet, there are powerful forces working to portray new, untested, and risky approaches to environmental crisis as logical and inevitable. They are not. The facts on the climate emergency speak for themselves. For decades, those most responsible for our overheating planet have willfully ignored and obscured the science, blocked change, and churned out profit with subsidies in one hand and impunity in the other. And we are already suffering the consequences. And without a radical change of course, future generations will inherit a far hotter, more polluted, more unpredictable, and more dangerous world. These same approaches of supremacy and subjugation are also causing terrible harm within human societies, because it's actually nurtured by the very same spirit. White supremacy, male supremacy, racial supremacy, religious supremacy, everywhere we see an attitude that could be summarized as me first, my community first, my group first, and I don't care about anyone else. We enslave, we colonize, we exploit for domination and profit. And we also see this play out in the many conflicts and crises and the atrocity crimes being committed from Myanmar to Ukraine, to Sudan, to Gaza, with little accountability. International human rights law and international humanitarian law are blatantly disregarded, and more than perhaps in the past. And we see also corporate interests profit from so-called forever wars. As we see on our screens every day, many of the most powerful in our world are deeply invested in a hierarchy of human lives. We see this in the skyrocketing levels of inequality within and between countries, and in a lack of support for economies that are in or at high risk of debt, distress, many of them disproportionately affected by climate change. And as a result, they are not able to invest in education, for example, and healthcare. We see it in a record numbers of people living in inadequate housing or without shelter. I'm always struck when I see how many homeless people you can find in the most richest cities on earth. We see it in new technologies that are being weaponized to oppress and marginalize. We see it in the continued efforts of fossil fuel companies to undermine solutions to the climate crisis, to preserve their profits at the cost of our climate and our rights. We see it in the violations of the rights of indigenous peoples whose lands and territories are being exploited and destroyed without their consent. And we see it in the culture wars against the fundamental principles of inclusion, equality, and non-discrimination. Nature itself has a long-term strategy. In fact, it doesn't even think about strategies. But what is ours? And I would like to share with you 4 fundamental tenets for this strategy. First, our strategy needs to embrace human rights as the compass for a sustainable future. There's a lot of discussion now on how to frame human rights precisely at a time of uncertainty and at a time of instability, because human rights can be that compass. Because our rights call for all people, now and in the future, to live in safety, security, and opportunity on a healthy planet. That's, if you like, the summary of it. When people have enough to eat, when they have access to clean water and education, when their right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is fulfilled, when people can express their opinions without fear, when the media can hold power to account, our societies are more peaceful, more stable, and resilient. Our human rights frame compassionate governance. It's a word we don't hear enough these days when you talk about governance, compassion and governance. The human rights ecosystem has roots that run in all directions, from peace and sustainable development to social cohesion, equality, and justice. And in the 76 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, it has become clear that our rights are also deeply intertwined. Like a natural ecosystem, human rights find their own equilibrium. I'm always fascinated by the research that I've seen about how trees communicate with each other. They send distress signals about drought and disease that lead other trees to alter their behavior. It's absolutely fascinating to see this. And they share nutrients to keep each other healthy. So there is an equilibrium there. And science continues to develop a deeper understanding of how natural systems connect and communicate. And we should really find inspiration for our own societies. What if humanity's unity with nature determined our politics? And what if we recognized that nature has rights too? Human rights, well, High Commissioner for Human Rights, but we are talking about the rights of nature. The rights of certain species are already widely recognized in many legal systems. Cruel treatment is illegal, while there are restrictions on animal testing and laws to protect wildlife, for example. What about an ocean? What about a glacier? What about a tree? Remember the outcry when the sycamore gap tree was cut, and where, in fact, 2 men were recently found guilty of this crime. So at some level, all people accept that a tree has a right to exist and grow, so too nature as a whole. And authorities around the world increasingly recognize aspects of the right of nature, even at the international level. The Kunming-Montreal Agreement on Biodiversity, which was adopted in 2022, acknowledges that the rights of nature are vital to successful implementation. The United Nations General Assembly has adopted a series of resolutions on harmony with nature. And the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has issued an advisory opinion stating that environmental components are legal interests in and of themselves. Following the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand, certain rivers have been granted legal identity and designated guardians, and they can be defended in court against environmental damage. Likewise, certain mountains and land of significance to indigenous peoples in various countries have been endowed with rights of their own. In South Asia, too, some rivers have specific legal recognition. Ecuador was the first country to recognize the rights of nature in its national constitution. These rights are also recognized at different levels of governance in Bolivia, India, Spain, Uganda, the United States of America, and beyond. It is no coincidence that countries at the forefront of recognizing the rights of nature have strong and active indigenous peoples. For many indigenous peoples, the rights of nature are a given part of their worldview, cultural practices, religions, and traditional laws. They understand that protecting nature necessarily reinforces human rights, particularly the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Rather than viewing themselves apart from nature, many indigenous peoples view human beings as part of nature, as embodied in this wonderful Maori proverb, "I'm the river, and the river is me." Ecuador's Constitutional Court ruled in 2021 that issuing mining permits that would harm the biodiversity of the Los Cedros protected forest violated the rights of nature. This ruling prevented continued harm against the forest while also protecting the human rights of people in the affected areas. One of the greatest challenges we face in the world today is developing models of governance that integrate different worldviews, perspectives, including those that recognize the rights of nature. And I invite academics and scholars and researchers to build on current laws, on some of these traditions and practices, and to consider what future models of governance that take into account the long term, including the rights of future generations, how they could look like. For example, they could involve constitutional recognition of legal standing for nature and its defenders, stronger protection against environmental harm, and recognition of the crime of ecocide, including under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. They could mean new and stronger laws, regulations, and enforcement mechanisms to ensure corporations are no longer able to treat our planet as an inexhaustible resource that is to be exploited. Businesses would be held accountable not only for harming people, but for harming nature, recognizing ultimately that all are part of the same web of life. Indeed, we need a society-wide conversation that reimagines the corporate sector, the goals of the corporate sector and their responsibilities to people and planet. Second, we need bold action based on human rights to cool our burning planet. Full implementation of the Paris Agreement is our only hope. Without it, humanity would be headed to over 4 degrees of heating, which would be, frankly, a death sentence for most. That figure is now at 3 degrees on the current trajectory. So we are making a little bit of progress, but clearly not enough, because the aim, as you know, is 1.5. This is why support, I think, is growing for a proposed fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that would aim to end the expansion of new oil, coal and gas projects and accelerate the transition to renewable energy. I'm impressed by a number of states that have welcomed this idea, including Colombia, despite its long history of fossil fuel dependency. Where there is political will, even countries which, with much at stake, can find a way. Just look at the Montreal Protocol which was agreed in 1987 to protect the ozone layer. It's quite a marvel of international lawmaking. It's, in fact, regarded as one of our greatest environmental success stories. And we need to celebrate the achievement and understand why it happened. When it was negotiated, critics argued that it would harm economies and people by restricting chemicals used in refrigeration. Well, today we don't even talk about it anymore. And the reality was quite the opposite. Markets did not crash. The ozone layer is on track for near complete recovery. And it really has important lessons for negotiations, including on a global plastics treaty. And you probably are aware that this global plastics treaty is being negotiated as we speak. It also shows that even though we may not have all the answers, we need to move forward with this courage, determination, and creativity. And climate action is already spurring ideas and action to improve lives around the world, and we really need to build on this. How can we expand electric transport systems, green spaces, walkable neighborhoods, and low emission zones? The capacity for innovation is at an all-time high, and the transition away from fossil fuel dependency is a laboratory for new ideas. Renewable energy is already the cheapest power option in most parts of the world. The cost of electricity from solar power fell by 85% between 2010 and 2020. Last year, renewables made up over 90% of new power capacity built around the world. And the signals from almost all G20 countries are clear. They are scaling up the transition to renewables, but it needs to be fast and it has to be equitable. Just to show about equity, only 2% of clean energy investments go to the African continent. So we need a systemic shift towards sustainable economies and societies, because it has wider implications for other economic sectors as well, from training workers to the extraction of critical energy transition minerals, but also tax policy. And we must make sure that all these changes, from transport to supply chains to healthcare to finance, are coherent and founded in human rights. Fossil fuel companies and their supporters are desperate to portray the just transition as unrealistic and unachievable. And a new generation of economists, many of them women economists, are proving them wrong. My office strongly advocates for a human rights economy where all policies, from taxation to climate action, keep a clear focus on advancing human rights and protecting the planet. It's this, when you want to give a mission to an economic system, you can also define it from a human rights lens. For example, in a human rights economy, states would equitably phase out fossil fuel subsidies, and they would regulate environmentally destructive activities. They would invest in renewable energy, sustainable food systems, and social safety nets to help people adapt and adjust. Investors and businesses would transparently disclose and divest from sectors that are doing irreparable harm to our climate and to our environment. Digital technologies can obviously help to turbocharge the transition to renewables and to sustainability more broadly. We know about the potential of artificial intelligence tools, can optimize wind and solar power, predict natural disasters, track pollution, help monitor illegal fishing, logging, and other environmental crimes. But we have seen the use of AI also for other purposes. And we need to make sure that the shift to AI is indeed used for the purposes of being transformative and equitable. Because while there is unprecedented power for good, we have also seen that these technologies have equally massive potential to cause harm to societies and to individuals. And in particular, the concentration of AI in the hands of a few billionaires is cause for serious concern, particularly when some have authoritarian or cultish spiritual aspirations. The business model of social media platforms is already fueling polarization and even extremism, including climate denial and disinformation. Meanwhile, AI data centers, and we don't often talk about this, they suck up massive amounts of energy and water, and the AI tools are also exacerbating existing inequalities and the digital divide. As you know, there was last September, the United Nations Pact for the Future was adopted. It includes an agreement on the need for global guidelines for the development of AI, and we really need to see implementation of it quick, much faster than one could possibly imagine. It would also help us create a safer and stronger information ecosystem which respects the right to privacy to the extent that this is still possible and protects also the spaces for exchange and dialogue. Third, we must deliver climate justice. That the countries that, and really this has to be, we need to remember this, the countries that did least to cause the climate crisis are paying the highest price. And it's frankly completely unacceptable. And some of these countries are even under an existential threat. We have seen some progress. In Egypt, during the COP negotiations, we saw that all countries agreed to an historical loss and damage fund, but it needs to be adequately funded and implemented. When the COP happened in the UAE, in the United Arab Emirates, countries agreed to a transition away from all fossil fuels in a just and equitable manner, leaving no one behind. Again, it needs to be implemented. And in Baku last year, developed countries agreed to triple climate finance to $300 billion by 2035, and all parties agreed to work together to increase finance to developing countries from public and private sources to at least $1.3 trillion per year by 2035. Yet, we need much more cooperation, determination to implement what was agreed, and we need all stakeholders to come together. Of course, governments, the private sector, the investors, the multilateral development banks, civil society, and local communities. Some projections estimate financial needs of over $10 trillion per year between 2030 and 2050. Unfortunately, during the Baku negotiations at the COP, human rights were a casualty of the negotiations on finance. Earlier draft texts did recognize the need to respect, protect, and promote and fulfill human rights, but this language was removed at a very late stage. This was not just a missed opportunity, but it's frankly a continuation of policies that created today's unsustainable and unequal world. We need to make those responsible for the climate crisis to pay up. Climate finance must be accessible to the people that are most affected, including women, younger people, children, and indigenous peoples. The state subsidies for fossil fuels, which amount to hundreds of billions of dollars per year, just imagine this. So we still subsidize fossil fuels with hundreds of billions of dollars. They need to be redirected towards creating a safer future. Imagine what the money could do if it invested in sustainable technologies. And we need to find new creative sources to fund climate action, from green bond markets to windfall taxes on fossil fuel companies, and frankly, a serious reform of the international financial architecture. And also at the national level, it's both the international and the national. I fully support the proposal by Brazil's G20 presidency for a billionaire tax to go towards reducing inequality and climate finance. And I hope that South African leadership will continue dialogue around this idea. Many developing economies are on the front lines of the climate crisis, while they continue to struggle with the fallout of the COVID pandemic. We hardly talk about that, but there has been a fallout and it's still continuing. The World Bank reported recently that 2020 to 2030, that this decade could be a lost decade for development, with the poorest and least developed countries bearing the brunt. And we see with the Pact for the Future that it tries to address this issue of inequalities, first and foremost through a more representative multilateral governance and reform of the global financial institutions. We are within the system, within the United Nations system, we are very much pushing for these reforms, but we again need to see it matched by action. Words are simply not enough when it comes to this particular issue. And we really need to see commitment at the forthcoming fourth conference on financing for development later this month in Sevilla in Spain. Distinguished guests, dear students, climate justice is broader than finance, and there I will add the particular human rights angle to it. And we need to learn from history. Inequality and injustice give rise to deep grievances that can erupt in cycles of violence. Our current unsustainable economic models are creating grievances that need to be addressed. And it is therefore crucial that countries and fossil fuel companies are held accountable. And we have seen courts at all levels signaling that states have an obligation to protect their people from the impact of the climate crisis. European Court of Human Rights affirmed in a landmark decision last year that states have enforceable human rights obligations to address climate change. And in fact, that case was brought, and I met some of the Swiss women who made this work, who brought this case to Strasbourg, and it actually shows people power at work. National courts around the world are demonstrating greater willingness to hold those responsible for climate harm to account. Last week, interesting decision, a court in Germany accepted in principle the link between emitters here in Germany and damage caused by melting glaciers in Peru, which, as you can imagine, for all the lawyers in the room, that's quite a stretch, but it's an interesting decision that they took. Later this year, both the International Court of Justice and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights are expected to issue keenly anticipated advisory opinions on states' human rights obligations around climate change. And in fact, the International Court of Justice case was sparked by students from the University of the South Pacific who were deeply concerned by the existential threat that they saw because of obviously rising sea levels and the threat it poses to their cultures and to their countries. And they succeeded in persuading the government of Vanuatu to bring the issue to an international level. So again, people power at work. The United Nations committees that monitor compliance with international human rights treaties also have a role to play. 3 years ago, one of these committees concluded that Australia had failed to protect indigenous Torres Straits Islanders against the adverse impacts of climate change. And we see in university and civil society more generally that we need to build on these success stories and press really the legal case for states to act on the climate crisis. The other element to this is that climate justice also involves righting past wrongs, healing, and reconciliation. And I come to speak, and that's probably quite unusual, to speak about transitional justice and climate justice. As you know, transitional justice is a rights-based framework. It was developed to help societies move forward from authoritarianism and conflict, but I think it also offers some interesting insight to address the profound injustices that are related to climate. For example, truth-telling encourages broad and open acknowledgement that harm has been done. And we need an accurate, science-based account of exactly what the fossil fuel industry knew about climate change and when, and how it kept that knowledge from the public. That would be a very important truth-telling process. In fact, in transitional justice issues, international commissions of inquiry have helped many countries to move from conflict to peace by investigating serious human rights violations and abuses and making recommendations for the future. So the question arises, why not, for example, a commission of inquiry into the climate and environmental crisis? It would be composed of scientists, of environmental lawyers, of indigenous peoples, of representatives, human rights experts, of course, and it would explain how human action has contributed to climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution, and where responsibility lies. Remedy and reparation are also central to transitional justice, and in the climate context, we know that some damage may be irreversible, and those who are affected are entitled to compensation and rehabilitation. Corporate accountability initiatives are essential to repair such damage and to ensure it is not repeated. And I welcome the support from the European Union, from Brazil, Thailand, and others for binding regulations to prevent human rights abuses in the extraction of critical minerals. The Secretary General last year also published important recommendations to ground the revolution that we need on the renewable front in justice and equity. It's very similar to this topic. Above all, transitional justice is centered on the voices and the needs of the people who have been most affected, because that's the healing and the listening process. And these are often the most marginalized people. And when it comes to our climate, that means indigenous peoples, it means women and girls. We know how disproportionately they are affected already by the climate crisis. It means also people with disabilities, local communities, but also minorities of all kinds. And there is the rights of young people, of children, of future generations is a paramount consideration that needs to be factored into all of this. We know that our children will be most affected by this overheating planet, and they had no part in any of the decisions that got us here. There is also an important gender dimension, as I mentioned before, which calls for women's full participation, representation, and leadership in every stage of the response. Fourth and final point, our strategy requires strong political leadership and social mobilization. Many governments are not meeting the urgency of this moment. On climate, they are out of step with their people. Recent studies, very interesting, show that 89% of the world's people want stronger action to fight the climate crisis. Research also suggests that citizens of rich nations strongly back financial support for poorer countries that are on the front lines. In both cases, people with these views mistakenly believe that they are in a minority, that there is little they can do to change things. It also shows how politics of distraction works when people feel like that. In other words, disinformation and divisions are having a deadly impact. The polarizations in our societies lead precisely to the lack of political will and action. So we need to amplify the voices of the silent majority. We need to join forces to apply maximum pressure and push political leadership into action. In a world that is torn apart by conflict, the existential threat of climate change has fallen off the radar. And we need to really do everything in our power to put it back at the top. I remember in 2019 when the climate summit took place in New York, it was before COVID, there was a summit, it preceded the Climate Action Summit with governments, that was only composed of children and of young people. And it was their pressure in New York that helped put the pressure on the political leadership to take action. Unfortunately, I don't see that same mobilization anymore today. The Brazilian presidency of the COP30 has called for a global mobilization. They call it the Mutirão, to build momentum for climate action. Locally, nationally, regionally, we need people everywhere to push for change within the communities and beyond. And we see that so many people are already active across all ages, across all regions. I'm thinking of people like the marine biologist in the Bahamas who lost her home to hurricanes 3 times and is now helping to restore mangrove forests, the mangroves. The public policy researcher in Egypt who is empowering young women to pursue careers in renewable energy. And school children around the world who often lead local efforts on climate and the environment. And I've met many of them throughout my years as High Commissioner. So never underestimate your own contribution and influence. And it's clear that businesses and universities also around the world need to step up. It's clear that many governments will not move without consistent, widespread public pressure. With science under attack in several countries around the world, supporting independent climate research within universities and other centers of excellence is more important than ever. Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights makes it clear, and I quote, that everyone has the right to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. And never has this right been more crucial or at such risk. Distinguished guests and students and friends, the climate crisis is not just about the weather or about renewable energy or even fossil fuels. Beyond renewable energy, beyond subsidies, beyond the just transition, it calls on all of us to shape new ways of living. In fact, it's a clarion call for a new type of politics, a reinvention of, a reimagining of politics and leadership, and frankly, new approaches to leadership. A more honest politics that doesn't hide behind concepts of me against you, us against them, humanity against nature, a fact-based politics that takes science and scientists seriously, that accepts the realities of climate and environmental related harms and deals with them effectively and urgently. A more relevant politics that tackles today's problems rather than distracting people with culture wars. A practical politics that recognizes the inherent contradictions in all of us without rejection or division. A politics for the 21st century that is not based on outdated concepts from the 19th century. I found the emotional outpouring after the death of Pope Francis remarkable because it reverberated across all faiths. And it also signaled a thirst for leadership through compassion, humility, and service. And it shows there is a craving for a new kind of leadership that is anchored in dignity and not in dehumanization, in dialogue, not conflict, in inclusion, not division. A desire to connect with people, with nature, to listen and to understand. And I compare it with the 3-eyed chameleon. We need an eye on the past, we need to learn from history, we need an eye on the present to act with reason and compassion, and we need an eye on the future and our responsibilities to our children and future generations. In short, we need governance that is guided by the fundamental values and principles that unite us all. Governance that truly serves all its people and reflects their hopes and aspirations. Governance that tackles the difficult long-term problems for the benefit of all and not just the short-term electoral cycles. And I challenge everyone and everyone who is listening to think about how we can all contribute to a new era of politics. We need a global movement for change founded on human rights, on human dignity, and to transform our governance for the common good and build, as a result, a much more sustainable future for all life on our planet. Thank you very much.
Dr. Türk, thank you for that really insightful lecture. And I know immediately, I can hear from the noises behind me as I was listening to your talk, that you have raised a number of issues there which really deeply chimed with our audience. I'm sure there are many people who would like to ask questions. What I propose is that we might take 2 or 3 questions to begin with and then get you to respond to them as a group, if that's okay. So, colleagues, who would like to kick off? I'm going to come to an old hand here at the front, Colin Tudge.
Thank you for a very fine lecture, but how do we deal with the fact that in a free election in America, the American people overwhelmingly elected a guy who is totally against more or less everything you said, and in this country, we are quite likely to elect Nigel Farage, who is a sort of scion of Trump. How do we deal with this fact? I mean, I take your point that most people are in favour of the kind of things you're saying, but that's not what's actually reflected in the political mood.
Okay, thank you. Question at the back there.
Thank you for your time. Hi, Commissioner. You alluded over the course of your talk about the inequity as it pertains to responsibility for the climate crisis. And you have, I think of countries like Brazil, for example, which are responsible for stewardship of the Amazon rainforest, as well as African countries that are heavily dependent on coal and other, non-renewable sources of energy, who are being told to shift to renewable sources of energy. And some of the pushback that you see from these countries is that they feel as if they're being told what to do by very powerful, wealthy, resource nations without necessarily being given the resources to actually embark on that energy transition. So could you please explain what policies are currently being implemented or can be implemented to allow for this transition without it feeling as if it's being imposed by more powerful nations who do have a larger share of the responsibility for the climate crisis?
Thank you. A great question. And I'll take one final question before we have our first opportunity to respond.
Thank you. Thank you for the excellent talk. I know, Dr. Türk, you have a background in refugee rates, and you didn't speak too much in the talk about the likelihood for the climate crisis to exacerbate existing issues we have with regards to refugee flows and refugee rates. So I'd like to invite you maybe to speak a bit about your views on this topic. Thanks.
Well, let's take one more, and then perhaps we'll to come back to you. So one more question. So we have a question here in the middle.
Thank you very much. In the most government, they use the benefit cost analysis to do the policy making, and how to deal with we monetize the human right when we do the the benefit cost analysis, which means sometimes we need to monetize the human right. See what is the price for human life? What is the price for the freedom of human? Do you think that is immoral to do that analysis? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'll leave you to respond to those.
Okay. Look, I think the most important thing is to get people into politics again. I think people have shied away from it for much too long. I also see that people who go into politics these days are no longer those who actually have this common good in mind, or if you like, what is the public good. In fact, we hardly have discussions anymore about public or common goods. And it sort of has left the theater to people of the economic and political elite to seek leadership positions who are far removed from the actual realities of most people around the world, which is why we have seen some of these very deep grievances that people have, and why you see also increasingly social movements and protest movements in many countries around the world that actually want some change. The problem is, how do you translate this into politics? I don't think that the people in the US voted for cruelty. I don't believe that people vote for excluding, dividing, and scapegoating. I think they are in some ways misled. There is huge politics of distraction. I think we see it also, it's not just the US, it's in Europe as well, it's in many other parts of the world too. It's just, I wish that education would bring forward, as I said, this, what politics means in the 21st century, because we are unfortunately caught up in these short-term electoral cycles, and for the long-term issues, which is why you had international law, because international law always guaranteed the commitment to addressing long-term issues, which is why some of them are trying to dismantle international law. But we can't, the world can't afford this, because it's the counterweight to the short-term electoral cycles. And I really wish, which is what I said, that there was more realization about countering what otherwise would become quite a dystopian political culture. And there are ways, and as I said, the statistics bear it out. People do care about the climate, they do care about the other, they don't want to fall back into this old-fashioned thinking, but they are fed with, unfortunately, the algorithms don't help on the social media side. So there is a huge responsibility on platforms for social media as well. And, you know, I'm always worried when I see that content moderation gets thrown into the freedom of expression debate without any understanding that human rights law itself does not allow hate speech and incitement to violence and harmful disinformation to flourish. So I can only hope, and I think in academia you play a very important role also to build up a future genre of leaders who will take up precisely that reimagining of politics in the 21st century, so that, because all of what I see today is old-fashioned, it's 19th century, it's going backwards enormously, and it's not the future. And I think they also want us to feel powerless, but we are not powerless. We have a lot of power, and frankly, I see this in so many social movements around the world who are often not, you know, and we had a discussion with some academics earlier today, where sometimes the problem of social movement, how you connect it then with politics, that's still a gap that we haven't really figured out how it best works. I mean, look back at the Arab Spring and what happened to the countries afterward. So how do you translate politics into the 21st century and build on what is fundamentally human and brings people together at the fundamentally human level? And we really need to reinvent it. And I think it's a challenge for all of us. I don't have all the answers how you can reinvent politics, but I think we need to see it as part of the solution. Look on, I mean, you know, in the climate negotiations, there was, I mean, the lawyers, of course, know this very well, there was this concept of common but differentiated responsibilities. That was a frankly, a compromise formula, precisely because of the fundamental responsibility issue. I mean, the richness, or the fact that so many countries became very rich, not least because of the fossil fuel exhaustion, was also because it was built essentially on a much smaller portion of the world than, and the others did not necessarily benefit from the same, and as a result ended up in a much different situation. The one thing to compensate is through financing, and that's why these financing negotiations in the COPs are so complex and so difficult. But it does mean, what I mentioned in my speech, that there needs to be massive infusion of climate financing precisely to achieve the transition to renewables and to a greener and also more social future, because the issue was always how do you marry a greener transition with a social transition, but it is possible. I mean, ILO has done a lot of work on this, and it's just the political will, again, that needs to do that. On refugee migration, I mean, as you know, when you undertake climate modeling, you will see, even in the next 10 years, how certain parts, Somalia, Sahel, for example, or Central America, will, because of drought and extremely high temperatures, will become uninhabitable. Currently, you have people living there, but even within 10 years, it will probably be almost impossible to live there. So it will trigger migration. That migration will be, in large parts, internal. So it will affect countries in a massive way, because you will see more and more, and it's probably not sudden, it's more slow onset. I mean, it's because these are slow onset disasters, if you like, and they will trigger more and more migration, and we are seeing it already today. And if it's not addressed through creating opportunities, integration, and all kinds of other things, yes, it is potential, because you come to the issue of competition over land and resources, so it could trigger more conflicts if one isn't careful about it. So there is absolutely a link, and I think some of you have been doing a lot of studies on this very important topic. Look, human rights is, if you define it in terms of interests, and maybe the easiest example is to say that business and human rights have come together more over the last couple of years. There are guiding principles on business and human rights. And it is not because suddenly everyone wants to be a human rights champion. It's because they see it in their own interest that if they apply a human rights lens, it actually is better for their own business. I mean, consumers, the consumers of the future and the employees of the future do care about, I mean, among young people, we know that they do care about human rights issues. So for anyone who has any business interest, they would look out for future employees and future consumers, and they would want to see that they respect in their supply chains, that they have human rights due diligence policies, and that they have risk frameworks applied that actually make them convince their consumers that they are doing the right thing. And that's incredible power on all of us, by the way, because the consumers have a lot of power because they decide where they spend their money. And we know that there has been, if you look back at the last couple of decades, so much more awareness and consciousness about what we consume, where we consume it, who is giving us the products and so forth, and that actually is a huge power. So it is in the interest of business to do the right thing and to base their decisions and their vision on human rights. So it's an interest issue rather than monetary. So if you want to make profit in the future, you embrace human rights.
High Commissioner, you spoke in your speech about the importance of young people to your agenda, and I'm I'm very pleased to say that we have here in the audience today a number of pupils from local schools, and I'd like to invite them to ask a question. Is there anybody from, I believe we've got pupils here from Charwell and Swan. If there's anybody from either of those schools who would specifically like to ask a question, you're very welcome to do so. Well, perhaps once we're letting them... There we go. Great. Good.
Do you think that movements like the Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil are more helpful or like more of a hindrance? Like, do you think it looks kind of immature to the people in charge, or do you think it's raising needed awareness?
She asked whether movements like Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil are useful.
Well, I can only say to you that
I was impressed when I met children who came to New York. I mean, you know, Greta Thunberg, of course, was the very strong symbol for this, but there were many, many children around the world who demonstrated on Fridays for Future. They talked to their parents. they mobilized for what they cared about, and it's children and young people. And I can tell you, it has huge influence on politics. Never underestimate your power. So yes.
should I maybe stay here or do you?
Well, do we have any further questions? I think maybe we'll have one more round,
Okay.
Commissioner, if you're happy, and then... so, Dylan, could you...
Thank you for your talk again. Picking up on the question asked a little earlier, I'm from Pakistan myself, and in countries like that, only recently there was an election and the party elected was not the one that was voted for by the public. The person that was actually voted for is now in prison, and he was more prone to helping causes like climate change and working for them. So in countries like that, where at the same time there are people who are dying of heat strokes, where temperatures are hitting at least 50 degrees centigrade in the summers, what can the UN do to help nations like that when even voting for the right party doesn't do anything? Thank you.
This is not directly related to the theme of your lecture, but on the 1 o'clock news on the BBC, they reported a recent speech that you made in which you said that Israel is guilty of a serious number of war crimes. And could you elaborate on that? And more specifically, do you think Israel is guilty of ecocide, the destruction of the environment, and secondly, whether Israel is guilty of genocide, the crime of all crimes?
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on the question that Nick asked people to ask questions from young people, which is sort of the converse, which is what can adult human rights activists or educators do to help young people's voices be taken into account in the formal systems of the UN?
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to take one more question, and then we'll allow the High Commissioner to respond.
United Nations consists of governments, but when a conflict like Ukraine, one of the P5, Russia is involved, very difficult for UN to solve. In case of Israel, US is very much behind, and US is one of the P5, very difficult to solve. And more that the issues which the government cannot, or in a worse position to deal with, and UN is consisting of the governments. And there are some ways in which more direct people's wills could be used to change various conflicts. United peoples or united NGOs rather than united governments.
Thank you.
Before I just want to clarify one thing, because also I think as educators, as I understand the question when it comes to the involvement of young people, and in UN processes, we actually have a whole outreach to young people, and we have in fact created an office for youth, a UN office for youth. And I think the education side is absolutely critical. And I just want to clarify one thing. When it comes to activism, it is also important that activism does not become disrespectful of the law or not. I mean, we need peaceful activism. It's not about activism that breaches the law or breaches peace or so forth. And I think that's also important, that there are ways and means to engage and to actually be part of a social movement that is respectful of the law. And I think we have also seen in some instances, unfortunately, in the areas where indeed that needs to be addressed. So and I think it is also upon the state to provide the opportunities to not only be able to listen and involve young people, not as tokenism, but as a meaningful participation. And I think that is also very important, because if young people do not feel that they are listened to, if they don't feel that they're heard, it does create a problem, and it creates precisely the type of tensions that we then see. So it needs to be thought through very, very well, how you bring in children and young people. And we have actually, in our processes in Geneva, we have worked quite a bit on this. We work to bring in children, for instance, in some of the considerations of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, but also the Human Rights Council. And it requires a lot of preparation, because we don't want it to become purely tokenism. It has to be meaningful, and your voice needs to be heard and needs to be taken into account. And there we actually had a youth declaration in the context of the Pact for the Future. So we need to find these avenues so that they lead to something that is constructive and helpful. Look, Pakistan, of course, is a country that is indeed one of the climate hotspots in the world. I remember the very difficult issue when you have the extremely high temperatures, but then you have the flooding, and you have been affected. I mean, the country has been affected by flooding on many occasions. The UN's response in country is obviously the humanitarian response to support the people when it comes to providing disaster relief and all kinds of, well, even financial relief for people who are directly affected by it. On the human rights front, we will always, whenever there are human rights issues, we obviously take them up with the government, with the authorities. But I cannot say that this will immediately lead to a change, because we don't have that power. We only have the power to influence and to find ways and means to deal with, especially serious human rights violations when it comes to journalists, human rights defenders, and people within the civic space. On Israel, Gaza, I mean, I think in my statements have been absolutely clear over the last couple of, 20 months or so, both at the beginning on the 7th of October, where I was absolutely clear about the absolute condemnation of what Hamas did, the trauma that it has caused in the country, but also my clear words when it comes to the conduct of warfare by Israel, and the many issues that unfortunately that conflict has brought to bear. And I only hope that in this current situation that reason will prevail, and that there will be a ceasefire, there will be a release of all the hostages, and that there will be massive, massive humanitarian aid coming in, because then, frankly, that's the one thing that at the moment worries us the most, because the situation is absolutely disastrous for the Palestinians in Gaza, for the civilians who suffer on a daily basis in an abominable way, and this needs to be addressed. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And the UN is ready to do this if we are allowed to, and that is part of the problem. We are not allowed to do it in the way that we should. On governance, and the Security Council and so forth. The Security Council is what the Security Council is. It has been mostly dysfunctional when it comes to the big crisis because of P5 power politics and the geopolitical tensions that we see. There are still decisions that they're able to take on situations that are not necessarily in the limelight, for example, Haiti. But the problem again was, the arms embargo was not implemented or not implemented sufficiently, which is why you have all these gangs still getting guns and armament. You don't have enough sanctions against the people who are behind the gangs, despite the fact that you have a Security Council resolution on this. So I think we need to move to a world where international law is put again on a much higher level and respected as such, including the institutions that defend them. And that includes not only the United Nations agencies, including my office, but it also includes the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. And and the European Court of Human Rights for Europeans. I've sometimes seen statements that are not only disrespectful of the international institutions, but also very manipulative, because they say things that are simply not true. And we're going back into this, lying, as we need to make lying wrong again, basically, because that, I think, is very important, because sometimes it seems to be done in different ways, but we need to make lying wrong again, yes. Okay, thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid the time has flown by, and our speaker this evening has more than definitely earned his supper. And given that the chef will be pacing up and down in Linacre College, expecting us there very shortly, we should draw these proceedings to a close. But I'd like to thank, first of all, our lecturer this evening for giving an outstanding Linacre Tanner lecture, both inspiring and insightful. And I took particularly to heart your call to us here in the university, not only with that research agenda that you laid out very clearly for us, but also for our need to communicate and to educate better. So thank you for that. And I hope you will join me once again in thanking our 2025 Tanner lecturer, Dr. Volker Türk.